just a very quick introduction to Desh, and we'll have him share his insights. I would not exaggerate if I were saying that Desh is a personal hero for me and for so many of you in the room. Desh is a fellow IIT Madras alum whom I've known for more than 12 plus years. And there are several reasons why I say that he's my hero. Not just because he has a PhD, not just because he's one of the most successful businessmen in the US, not because he's done so many wonderful things in the world of social innovation. It's more than anything else, the thing that touches my heart is his humility in spite of accomplishing all that he's done. His humble nature, his accessibility, and his selfless attitude towards the things that he does. I just want to very briefly mention in terms of the work that he and his team have been doing in Hubli, in northwest Karnataka for the last 5 years. It's an experiment called the Sandbox. And basically, Desh and his wife Jayashree have started this Deshpande Foundation, through which they've been sponsoring the work of about 60 to 80 different NGOs in education, healthcare, energy, livelihoods and agriculture, 4 sectors. And they have been, the core aspect of their work is in terms of the work that he's doing in Hubli is not a regional development initiative, which he's doing just because it's his native place and things are going to be good as long as his native place is served. He views this as a social innovation lab. He's trying to kind of look at what organizations are making progress through the resources provided, and whichever organizations are thriving, additional resources are provided so that they truly scale. I just want to mention one great example of the work that he's done. There's an organization called Akshay Patra, which is basically about providing midday meals to school children in government schools in India. This program was started about 10 years ago, where they started by feeding midday meals to school children in about 1,000 to 2,000 kids in and around Bangalore. And now, 10 years later, they feed 1.3 million school kids every day in 20 locations around the country. So talk about scale, there's no better example than that. And the thing which is kind of really kind of energizing about this particular example is just in terms of the best practices of the business world that are being brought to bear in the social development world. So if you walk into his kitchen in Hubli, which feeds about, I think, 200,000 kids in 100-kilometer radius, the kitchen looks like a petroleum refinery. You see these tall towers wherein, one tower they're separating the rice from the stones, one tower boiling of the rice, one tower boiling of the sambar, and all the best quality methods to kind of, this automation for packing of the meals. So you get high quality meals for low cost, I think 6 rupees, 8 rupees per meal. And so much so that this has come to the attention of somebody like President Bill Clinton, who when the Haiti earthquake happened a few years ago, he took Desh along with him in his jet to Haiti to see if similar kitchens could be set up for the faster dissemination of quality meals in Haiti. So that is the kind of example of an organization that is sponsored by the Deshpande Foundation in Hubli. And in addition to the work that he does, he's, among his other honors, he's an advisor to President Barack Obama. He's a co-chair for his Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. He sits on the board of MIT, the most famous engineering college in the world, where he's been on the board for more than 10 years. He's got the Deshpande Center for Technology Innovation at MIT. And the Sandbox kind of initiative which he's doing in Hubli, he's also doing in the US, a location in the US and the location in Canada. So this is truly a big hero, a true son of India. I'm really proud that the Deshpande Foundation is partnering with AFI. Will be signing a formal MOU with their organization tomorrow. And I'm so glad that Desh is here to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. Asha Didi, Brother Ram, thank you. Thank you very much for hosting us and also setting the right meditative, contemplative mood for us to really celebrate the work of all the heroes and heroines here. These people are the true inspirations for what India really stands for. Because I go around and see a lot of countries. A lot of the countries probably have average per capita income a lot more than what India has. But one unique thing about India is that a lot of the people have hope in India. It's amazing how when you walk around, a lot of people don't have much, but they somehow feel that even if they don't have much, their kids are going to do well. And a lot of that is because a lot of the effort that you people put into it. And that hope hope becomes the biggest asset any country can have. Because when countries lose hope, in places like either Palestine or Pakistan or some other places, if people don't have hope, there's nothing you can negotiate with, right? I mean, if they don't have hope, what do you do? I mean, it's a useless thing. And what this world needs most is probably hope. And I'm hoping that India, even though today it's famous for some of the software and all that kind of stuff, that a few years from now, the biggest thing this country can actually export to the rest of the world is that hope, which becomes the most precious commodity. So I'm very, very proud of, I've had the opportunity to speak to quite a few of you, and very proud of the work that all of you are doing and the sincerity and the compassion that you have for this world. I think I'm sort of a new kid in the block in this sector, so I'm not sure I can tell you people a lot more than what you already know, because I've sat through some of the discussions and so on. But maybe what I'll do, I know we probably have 15, 20 minutes before we have to feed you people. You must be hungry. So maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about my journey and a few observations that I've made through this journey. My journey in this sector actually started about 12 years ago. Year 2000 is when I decided that I want to stop being a CEO, entrepreneur, and become more a coach. And I sort of started spending a little bit more time on both sides of the sector, the nonprofit and the for-profit sector. So the first big initiative we did was we started a center at MIT. I joined the MIT board in year 2000, and the focus behind starting the center at MIT was a lot of the companies that we did in 70s and 80s, the core ideas came from places like Bell Labs. And the Bell Labs had sort of vanished by year 2000 because of global competition. And so the center of gravity for new idea generation had squarely moved back to universities. And US spends about $50 billion a year funding research in universities. And the idea was, what can we do to sort of have these ideas really contribute more to the economy? How can you have more social and economic impact with all the thinking and the research that these people do? MIT and Stanford and Caltech, I mean, they're probably the best in the world. They already do a pretty good job. And so but the effort was to see if we can actually formalize how we can do better and then get the whole thing going. So the sort of the core idea behind this center at MIT is that innovation plus relevance is equal to impact. That is, unless innovation, new ideas, are directed to some burning problem in the world, they don't have an impact, right? And so it's a very simple formula. Innovation plus relevance is equal to impact. Because what happens is that for people to come up with new ideas, you have to create a very nurturing environment. And people have to, because you can't mandate innovation. And most of the people who think about these new ideas have a huge desire for impact. They want to cure cancer. They want to help create a lot of clean water and new air, air to breathe and so on. But what happens is that slowly, as you create this nurturing environment, it becomes clubby in nature. And as it becomes clubby, it gets further and further removed from the real world. And so slowly, the game becomes more impressing each other as opposed to the impact. And so there has to be a very conscious effort to actually connect the innovators to the real world to actually see the impact. I'm sure it's the same thing in the development world. There's a lot of professionals in the development world who just go from conference to conference to conference and impress each other, and nothing much happens, right? So how do we make sure that we actually consciously connect innovators to relevance was sort of the experiment. And it worked out pretty good. We funded about 90 projects, and 26 of them have become companies. And more than 26 companies, it's actually changed the culture and the way you innovate. And now it's being applied to the NSF, which does $7.4 billion, NIH, which does $30 billion. So it's really, so that piece worked. And so for technological innovation to have impact, you have to connect thinkers to doers, and the doers have to think, and the thinkers have to do to really see the impact. Now, about 8 years ago, my wife, Jayashree, she also went to IIT Madras. And so we said, well, what can we do about this in India? And so the first reaction was to do the same center in IIT Madras, because we were already working with IIT Madras. But after a while, somehow technological innovation in India didn't sound that exciting. So we said, well, let's see if we can do social innovation, right? But for social innovation, that equation gets turned around. I talked about innovation plus relevance is equal to impact. For social innovation, it's more relevance plus innovation is equal to impact. That is, the impact happens with a deep understanding of the problem itself, and then you bring whatever new ideas that you need to solve the problem, because the idea itself doesn't have to be a patentable idea, it doesn't have to be the most competitive idea, a differentiated idea, and so on. And so to really create that environment, we came up with this concept called Social Innovation Sandbox. A sandbox meaning it's a place to experiment, and also for the amount of resources that we could afford, we felt that we have to do everything within a region so that you create a critical mass. It's a little bit of Route 128 in Boston or Silicon Valley, where you actually create a critical mass of activity to create something happening. And so we have a lot of people. We probably have had maybe 100 people, young men and women from United States and UK and Italy and so on, actually come and spend time in Hubli. So it's an area of about 4 or 5 districts, 5 million people or so. It's big enough to have all kinds of issues, lots of villages and irrigated land, arid land, all kinds of issues, enough to sort of create an environment where you can address lots of issues, but small enough to create a critical mass. And so we had a lot of people come from outside, spend time there. But very earlier on, it was very clear that innovation, social innovation does not happen without local leadership, right? So we started a lot of local leadership programs. So we have a training program where we've trained maybe about 500 young men and women from the area there to be social entrepreneurs. We have a program for college kids where 4 college kids come together, pick a problem in the society and solve it. So today we have 10,000 students doing about 2,500 projects. So, and then we have another program called Hubli Champions, where young 30 to 40-year-old professionals who are really accomplished in their fields, doctors, lawyers, accountants, whoever, business people, they actually go through a 6-month program where they get exposed to all kinds of issues, whether it's education or livelihood or agriculture. And so they become champions and possibly board members for a lot of the other initiatives and so on. So it's just, there's a lot of local leadership development work that went on. We have about 60 people. And Naveen Jha, Naveen, can you stand up? Naveen Jha is the head of the foundation effort there. And so I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. And so I and Naveen will be available. Also want to introduce Raj Melville. Raj is the executive director for all of the foundation. He's based in Boston. Boston is where I live, I and Jayshree. And so Naveen has developed all kinds of training programs for these people, because ultimately when you come up with solutions, the solutions have to get implemented by people. How do you need leadership within people who make $1 a day, and then people who make $5 a day, people who make $10 a day. And then, of course, a lot of these people who come from outside who actually are very innovative, very competitive, very knowledgeable, but it's hard for them to think about what people experience when they live $1 a day. And so it's really trying to build sort of the whole ramp so that when you come up with solutions, you have a way to execute on it and also co-create the solution. And we work with about 50 interventions, and it's not really based on our ideas. It's really more based on, do we feel that somebody has an idea that, and more than the idea, do they have a team? It's just like the way venture capitalists would fund companies. You've always heard this expression of how you always fund A teams with a B idea versus a B team with an A idea. So we're constantly looking for these A teams. And then we do the same way you do a company. What is the innovation? And you narrow down the innovation, and then you fund the innovation so that either it works or it fails. If it fails, it's perfectly fine, because you try something else. But if it works, you have to scale it. And to scale it, financially, you have to think of one of the 3 models. either a free market economy. Some interventions lend themselves to a free market economy like a lot of you do. Some of them lend themselves to become a part of the government program. And some of them are based on very broad-based charity, not just a few people, but a very broad-based charity. And in a lot of cases, it's a combination of the three. But the organization have to start thinking about the scaling model up front so that they don't just get stuck, right? And so out of the 50, a few of them have scaled, like Sanjay was saying, Akshay Patra, last year it was a $30 million program, 155 crores in India. That's a huge program. In fact, by 2020, we are shooting for 5 million children, which is 150 million, 750 crore program. So out of the 30 million, 18 million came from the government. Out of the other 12 million, we raised about maybe $2-3 million in US and the rest of it actually in India, right? And the donor base is huge. It's really diverse. When you run a business, you don't want to have too many 5%, 10% customers. Because if you have concentrated customer base, it becomes very risky. So you'd rather raise $10 from 1 million people for your $10 million rather than getting 10 people to give you $1 million checks, right? So it's really diversifying your revenue base and, same concepts. So maybe what I'll do is let me tell you a little bit about my observation of what I've found in the two sectors. Obviously, I came from the for-profit sector, and now I see a lot of the other part of the sector. So both these sectors, you start with an entrepreneur who usually tends to be a little crazy. But it doesn't matter how crazy you are in the for-profit sector, ultimately you have to find a product or a service which somebody is willing to pay. It has to be useful for somebody, right? So in the for-profit model, you have a very natural way of finding the right service or the product because it has to be useful for somebody. If it's not, if you don't find that sweet spot, you either go bankrupt or you're out of business or you get merged with some other company. And so over the course of time, you only have performing assets in the for-profit sector. And it's very Darwinian in nature, right? Because there's a huge amount of competition. Constantly you're fighting for your competitive advantage. And unless you're useful for the customer, you have a restaurant, you don't serve good food for 2-3 weeks, you're out of business, right? So it's the power of the ability to pay and the choice that the customers have that make everybody do their jobs. In the nonprofit sector, because most of the time the beneficiary does not have the power to pay, over the course of time, the organization tends to focus more and more on the donors than they do on the people that they serve, because that becomes survival, right? So because of the lack of that feedback loop, you tend to come up with products that may or may not make sense. In fact, most of the time what happens is that particularly donors, when the donors get very actively involved in the effort, they tend to project their risk tolerance on the solution, right? So, and the donor was poor once and he sort of understood maybe the people, but now obviously he's a rich guy. And he constantly, whenever he talks to people, he says, hey, how is that possible? How could they be like that? And so, particularly in US, which is a more developed sector, every product is over-featured, too expensive, does not scale. So somehow, ability to co-create the products and the interventions with the people that need it is something that's very, very useful. So that's a part of the sandbox. The sandbox is not about somebody coming up with a solution and trying to bring it in, but really co-creating the solution within the sandbox. And you can see it clearly because we get a lot of young men and women from US coming and working in the sandbox. And a lot of these kids who come from MIT and Stanford and Berkeley and so on, they're very passionate. Some of these guys, they already know a year in advance that they're going to come into India. So they work so hard and they're so intense about what they want to do. But the more passionate and the more conviction somebody has about their solution are the people that fail, right? The people that come with an open mind and say, let me see what these people may need possibly, are the people who become successful. So just to give you an example, let me give you this example of this young lady from Berkeley who came to Hubli. And she's doing her master's in urban planning, right? Water planning. And so when she came, she thought she was going to put all these mechanisms and controls in the walls and everything else and control the pressure and get this water supply working, everything else. But quickly she found that that was not a good thing. But she had the ability to actually change her thinking. And so now she has a company. In fact, she was here last year, I think, Next Drop. How many of you know about Next Drop? Okay, so those of you who don't know, what she did was she looked at this town, and this town, 10% of the population gets 7/24 water. The rest of the people get water maybe 1 or 2 hours a day, right? But they won't tell you which 1 or 2 hours, right? Which is sort of normal in most of the cities. And so people, it makes their life miserable because they don't know, they can't go to work, they have to get up at night, turn the tap on, and you don't know. And so what she did was she worked with all the wall people and everything else, because Naveen Sandbox now, it's created an environment where any entrepreneur, anybody who wants to work there has access to pretty much any official, any town things, any people that they want to work with, because we've been working there for a while now. So she went to all these wall people and created a thing where when they go and turn the wall on, they dial a number and they press 1 for open, 2 for close, and if they know beforehand, they have another code to dial in and so on. And she charges people 10 rupees a month and sends an SMS as to when they're going to get the water, right? And so that's a huge value. And so now she has thousands of customers, and she's pretty close to breaking even. And so what she did was, it's true that in the long term, you do have to solve problems so that you have a better infrastructure, you have enough supply to meet the demand and all that kind of stuff. But in a country that's so limited in terms of the resources that you need for all the services, and this probably applies not just for the water, but almost everything, if there is a way you can make what's limited resources that you have available in a predictable fashion, you're solving a huge problem, right? And so she did it, and she can do it. So understanding the context and the relevance is very important for that part of the sector. So I think a lot of the effort that we are trying to do is to actually somehow bring the execution excellence of the for-profit sector to the compassion of the nonprofit, and bring the compassion of the nonprofit back to the for-profit sector. So if you combine the two, if you can recreate the same dynamics that you have in the for-profit, in the nonprofit. For example, Akshay Patra, we're trying to get the CEO to do earnings calls every quarter, so that just like every stockholder sort of knows what's happening with the company, we want to make sure that every donor knows what the issues are, what's happening, what have they done, what have they not done. We are trying to implement an independent audit. So we have a team that actually independently goes and visits every kitchen, every school, and then gets a report out, so that even though the kids can't pay money, you want to make sure that you have feedback from the kids in terms of how are they happy with the service that they get. So if there is a way you can act, and then what happens is engaging. So how do you, because in the nonprofit sector, or typically what happens is you come up with a solution, and 10 years later, it's the same solution, and it's the same video that they play again and again and again of somebody that has really benefited, right? Because there's no competitive pressure to actually do 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, and so on. So how do you keep an organization alive and competitive? So for example, Akshay Patra, we have a lot of experts engaged in the operations of the Akshay Patra. And of course, the people who run it, one is IIT Bombay graduate, another one is a gold medalist from IISc. So they're all ISKCON Swamijis, but they've chosen a life of service, but they are mentally very capable. So when you talk to them, they get the ideas right away. So we, for example, we have a nutritionist, a world's nutrition expert on soybeans in University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And so she came and actually spent 2 years in India trying to figure out how you incorporate soybean in the meals. Because we grow a lot of soybeans in India, but we don't use it for protein, for food, right? And so But when you put it in chapatis and things like that, the kids don't like the taste. And so finally, she came up with this thing where they make these chaklis, muruku. So they have an extruder machine now, which combines soybean and rice, and it grinds it and then extrudes it, and then fries it, and then there's a centrifugal thing that sort of removes oil, but not all the oil, because a lot of these kids don't get enough oil, as opposed to most of the people who get too much fat.